Hello, welcome to my channel. Welcome to Zay Historicizes. Obviously this is my very first video. Kind of nervous, been kind of putting it off for a while, but I do want to say this is like my 5th time trying. So we'll see how this goes. Anyways, you can tell from my title, if you can, I'm going to explain it. Zay Historicizes is going to be the name of this channel. Historicizing is simply looking at issues as they happen today, looking at modern issues and drawing parallels from these issues with our shared past. It's, to me, the best way of really truly understanding issues. It's the best way of getting to the bottom of why things are the way that they are, and understanding issues as they exist today is just looking back and seeing how they got there, you know, the principal players and how they got there, why there still seems to be an issue, why there's discrepancies. A lot of those things, you know, that sort of kind of plague our society, I feel like they can be historicized. Anything can be historicized, and that's just the best way to get to understanding them, in my opinion. So this channel is literally just going to be about me taking issues, things that are in part of popular discourse, political discourse in our era right now, and drawing parallels from our shared past. So this very first episode, as you can see, deals principally with two things. You have Juneteenth and you have critical race theory. Juneteenth is just recently, on June 17th, 2 days before the holiday. On June 17th, 2021, the Biden administration passed legislation making Juneteenth an officially recognized holiday that is going to be observed nationally. It's something that I think should have happened a very long time ago, and I do want to preface this and say that I'm not anti-Juneteenth, I'm not anti-critical race theory. I'm going to get into that a lot later, but I am somebody who just simply wasn't that familiar with it. Juneteenth is something that, again, should have been recognized ages ago, but just this month, the Biden administration passed legislation making it a federally recognized holiday. Critical race theory is something that I'm going to get into a little bit later, but it's also something that has been coming up a lot. It's been very, very, very controversial. We've seen a lot of people in the far right and the more conservative stances of things. They're really anti-critical race theory, and I'm going to be looking into the history of that as well, and exactly why those discrepancies and differences exist in the first place. But let's get first into Juneteenth. So Juneteenth, its namesake is based on June 19th, 1865. That was when Union General Granger in Galveston, Texas, announced that all formerly enslaved people had now been free. Were now free. So all enslaved people were now free in Galveston, Texas. It actually occurs almost 2.5 years, about 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which went in effect on January 1st of 1863, which abolished slavery in most of the Confederate territory and most slave states. What we do know is that Texas, however, was very remote at that time in the Union. So between 63 and 1865, slavery actually expanded. It saw an increase in Texas, but with the arrival of Union troops, as Union troops expanded into the southern states, obviously slaves were set free, they were emancipated, and Texas was sort of like that, I guess, the last huge battleground state. So on June 19th, 1865, General Granger, that is exactly what happened. That was when he announced that all formerly enslaved people were now free. It wasn't actually a formal end to slavery. There were other states, Delaware and Kentucky, I believe in particular, where slavery was not fully abolished in those territories, in those states, until December of 1865. And then we do know that in Indian Territory, or maybe we don't, that state, you know, Indian tribes like the Choctaw, who had aligned themselves with the Confederacy, obviously practiced slavery, and a lot of their slaves were not emancipated until 1866. So that's sort of just the background on that Juneteenth holiday, a lot of what was going on around that time. We sort of tend to look at slavery as this one uniform movement, that the federal government said that slavery is now abolished and all slaves were set free. We do know that is absolutely not the case. Things take a long time oftentimes because you have very, you know, hard-headed people who don't want to stop what they've been doing. That was literally their economy, you know, for well over a century now. It's all that they've ever known. As far as Juneteenth celebration goes, I do want to say, and just really to mention, that I'm not somebody who grew up celebrating Juneteenth. I'm not somebody who knew that Juneteenth existed until last year. That was the summer of George Floyd. That was the summer of Breonna Taylor. That was the summer when I think Juneteenth really became a lot more nationally known. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was the very first time I ever heard about Juneteenth. I'm the child of African parents. I was born in Cameroon. Both of my parents were born and raised in Cameroon. My aunts and uncles were all born and raised in Cameroon or Nigeria. So we don't have those ties, obviously, to emancipation, unlike Black American families who obviously do. Juneteenth has been celebrated since literally the next year, actually. In Texas in particular, we do know that the earliest Juneteenth celebrations were actually under the name of Jubilee, the Jubilee Day. And in 1866, Jubilee Day in Texas included just information for freedmen who were wanting to vote. It gave them voter rights, voting information, like educated them on how to vote and have their voices heard. And it's just very interesting to see that just 1 year later, they were not only recognizing their freedom from slavery, from bondage, but they were also finding ways to educate these newly freed people on how to participate in the voting process, which is really, really amazing to me. We also do have examples. In 1867, you had the purchase of Emancipation Land. It was an Emancipation Park in Houston, Texas, I believe, where you had a lot of, again, informally enslaved men, women, and children come to celebrate Jubilee Day. You actually also have it known as Emancipation Day, which I'm going to get to a little later. But in the late 1890s, I believe, and into the early 20th century, Juneteenth starts to be, it starts appearing in the literature. That is something that it starts going under that name, but it was still Emancipation Day in the 1930s. I believe it was in 1938 actually when the Texas governor at the time, Governor Allred, recognized the Emancipation Day of the Negroes, as he put it. Texas formally recognized that day as a holiday. So it's actually something that I find very, very interesting. I'm somebody who lives in Oklahoma. We don't exactly have the best racial track record. I'm not 100% sure about Texas, but I'm sure they don't either. So I do find it interesting that in 1938, a Texas governor formally recognized that holiday for he basically said that a lot of Negroes would go and celebrate it. So the Texas officially recognized that day, and I think that's very, very interesting. So that is just sort of the history of Juneteenth, why it's celebrated, how long it's been celebrated. I think a lot of people make it seem like it's this new thing. Of course, he had this sort of blowback after Biden announced that Juneteenth was going to be a nationally recognized holiday. People like Candace Owens saying that Juneteenth is lame. It's a sort of idea that it's legislated segregation. They're making it seem like it's new, but I do want to say that African Americans have been celebrating Juneteenth for a very, very long time. And during the era of the Great Migration, when a lot of African Americans sort of left the South and went into northern cities, they brought the celebration of Juneteenth with them. Tina Knowles recently, who's a mother of Beyonce, she said that they'd always been celebrating it. Of course, Beyonce, the Knowles family, they're from Texas. So Tina Lawson, I'm sorry. But, when you really look at it, it's something that has been celebrated for a very, very long time in that community. Even though I wasn't aware of it until very recently, I do want to shed light on the very, very long history of Juneteenth and how it's a holiday that has been celebrated by African Americans in this country literally since 1866. It's been about 155 years, and I do want to shed light on that. Thank you. All right, hello. So now we're going to get into critical race theory. So critical race theory is something that was developed in the mid-1970s. It pertains to the political, social, and legal ramifications of race and racism in our society. Like I said, it's incredibly controversial. It's something that has been such a hotbed topic recently. Several states have actually banned the teaching of critical race theory in grade schools, and it's something that is still actively being discussed as we speak. This has been a year where just recently, last year I actually interned for the Greenwood Chamber of Commerce, which is a remote internship out of Tulsa, and this year was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. I actually wrote an article for HistoryNet magazine that is specifically about Greenwood. Greenwood, which was the black business district that was destroyed during the era, during 1921, over 120 years ago. But what critical race theory looks at, it looks at the more subtle definitions and implications of racism. It's something that, again, was developed in the mid-1970s. So we've sort of gotten out of the civil rights movement. You've had the Voting Rights Act passed, Civil Rights Act passed, Loving versus Virginia has happened, Montgomery bus boycott, that whole era sort of passed. But what you do have is these more underlining issues of race as it plays out more subtly. And you know, this is the era where you're getting into things like redlining, the war on drugs and mass incarceration, which was still a little bit in the future at that time. But what you really are saying is that critical race theory does look critically at race in this country's history. So a really big issue that a lot of right-wingers and more conservative people have with it is just that they think it's going to raise a generation of people that dislike this country. America has a very long history of ignoring racism and basically acting as if it doesn't exist while still implementing it constantly. It's something that is an issue that I personally, if I had the power to, I don't. It's just not going to be something, I think it's something that you really need to educate people on, because a lot of people are very ignorant about just how, it's not just horrible, but there are so many this country was a society that was built around race. It was built around the superiority of some people to others. It was a country that was built on the chattel slavery of millions of enslaved black men, women, and children on land that was formerly inhabited by Native Americans. And race develops during the era of colonialism, during this era of expansionism, as European powers like Portugal and Spain and France and the Netherlands and the UK are coming to the New World. They're coming to the New World with this, in many ways, a superiority complex that they have to justify. That is their rights, that is manifest destiny. And so critical race theory looks at all those things. And it is something that a lot of people are very afraid of. But it's also why I really wanted to mention why I believe that Juneteenth and critical race theory, even Black Lives Matter, which we saw absolutely explode last year, bigger than ever, are very un-American, because at their root, part of what is a huge identity of this country is racism, is default whiteness. And default whiteness is this idea that anything that isn't white, anything that deviates from that norm is less than, is either going to be ignored or made less of. And it's just something that we still grapple with in our country today, and it's something that critical race theory, I think, is giving us the opportunity to at least address, honestly, and very, very directly. There are many, many ways that race sort of built itself around the society. So Candace Owens, of course, jumped on Twitter and she talked about how Juneteenth was lame and how July 4th is her Independence Day because she's an American. Emphasis on she's an American. It's the same logic with people like Ben Sherpo or, Tucker Carlson. A lot of this rhetoric of what being an American is, but we have to understand the history behind what it means to be an American, and when somebody so almost weaponizes the term of what an American is. So what I'm going to be looking back on is sort of like historicizing race as it's played out over the course of American history, and the ways in which race really came to define society, both for enslaved black people, but also for free black people as well. One of the cases that we do know is in 1640, on June 9th, it was the July 9th of 1640, you had 3 people who came to trial in Virginia for attempting to escape their tenures as indentured servants. 2 of them were white, and 1 of them was black. 1 of them was a Scotsman, 1 of them was a Dutchman, and 1 of them was identified on the July 9th, 1640 verdict as a Negro. His name was Joe Punch. What Joe Punch did with Victor and the other man, who were both white, they tried to escape the colony of Virginia into Maryland, I guess to escape their tenures as indentured servants. What we do know, however, is that when the trial came, when it came to trial, it was decided upon by the courts in Virginia that while the 2 white men were going to have their tenure as indentured servants extended, Joe Punch was actually sentenced to permanent servitude as a slave. He was going to be a slave for the natural born life of his master, for his natural born life, a property of his master's for his natural born life. And it's something that, it's a case that a lot of people aren't actually very familiar with, but it's something that really defines just how critical race was going to be, not only at that era, in that era, but as time moved forward. I'm going to read this one quote. It is from the South Carolina Slave Code in 1712, and it states that Negroes and other slaves brought onto the people of this province for that purpose are of barbarous, wild, savage natures, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of this province. When you see that terminology, Negro, slaves, and others, brought onto the people of this province, people has this default whiteness. People means white people. Negroes and slaves are all sort of put together. These are slave codes and these are slave laws that start to really expand in the late 17th century and into the 18th century, even before independence. So by the time you get to the July 4th, you know, I'm an American and I'm going to celebrate that Independence Day because I'm an American, Candace Owens. What you're getting into is a society where being an American meant being white. It meant being Christian. And if you deviated from that in any way, you were not part of that society. You were less than, and you were chattel property. So these slave codes, and just to go over several of them, slave codes that were passed during this era, slave codes and slave laws that were common, it was common that slaves were not allowed to own property of their own. They could not assemble without the presence of a white person, more than likely the overseer or master. They had curfews that were placed on them. Slaves could not testify against a white person in court. Or, you know, that was a rule as well. Slaves could not participate in juries. They could not read or write, so they couldn't be literate. And they could not carry a gun. The punishment for carrying a gun in Virginia was about 39 lashes, and you had to forfeit the gun. And it was also a crime to create a school for African-American children. It was up to a $500 fine and up to 6 months in jail. One thing that's very interesting about these slave codes is that the New York slave code in particular, which was implemented in 1712, that was after the slave... you had a slave revolt in New York in 1712. That slave revolt involved slaves. They caused arson, and I believe around 9 white people were killed during that revolt. This is still over a century before Nat Turner. It's before it's before Haiti. And these slave codes were ways to completely marginalize and I guess really double down on the freedoms of enslaved people, so that way they would be a lot less likely to participate in slave revolts and things like that. New York was a colony that had a actually fairly high percentage of free black people in the early 18th century, and a lot of New Yorkers believed that it was that, you know, camaraderie that may have existed between free blacks and enslaved black people that created this atmosphere that could cause this revolt. We also have to understand that a lot of these slave laws were not just related to enslaved people. These slave laws preceded laws that also infringed on the rights of free African Americans. This is where we're seeing race really, really start to play and take shape in society, because it's no longer a slave thing, even though at this time a majority of enslaved people, you know, all enslaved people, but a majority of black people would have been enslaved and in bondage. What you're really starting to see is that it's not really about being enslaved, it's really just a racial thing. In Ohio, you had the Ohio slave laws that were passed in the early 19th century. Free black people could not vote. Obviously, that was something that was still exclusive, I believe, to land-owning white men or white men who had served in militias. You cannot testify in court against whites, which is actually very, very important. The Virginia slave codes as well also address this issue, saying that a black person cannot testify free or enslaved against a white person. It's very, very legislative. Again, it's looking into, again, critical race theory as it addresses the court of law. You have black people cannot hold office, they cannot serve in a militia, and it was a $500 bond before getting to actually settle in some free states. So in Ohio, which is not a state that's actually heavily associated with slavery, you really had to jump through hoops and bounds to really prove your status as a free person in order to actually settle in Ohio as a free black person. In New York, blacks were not allowed to own property, and there was actually a provision after the slave code that after the riot of 1712 that said that no free black person born after 1712 could actually pass an inheritance on to their children. It's very, very tied to generational wealth, but it's something that is so concerted and it's so clear and concise what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a society where race is all that matters. Of course, now we live in this society where people act as if just because slavery was ended and all this, these laws were passed to address racism, systemic racism, it's no longer going to matter. But you have to understand what we've built on and how long these things were built on and how long it's going to take for us to deconstruct those issues to really move on as a society. And of course, after the New York Slave Revolt, I mean, you had a lot of in the New York Slave Code that had to do with the punishment of slaves by their masters, all the way up to maimment and even death at times. And when slaves to commit crimes, there were actually recommendations for very, very gruesome deaths when slaves could be put on trial for a crime that they may have committed, whether, you know, regardless of whatever that crime was. We also do have the matrilineal passing of slavery from a mother to a child. This is in an era where a majority, you still have, you know, mixed race, you have a mixed race population. A majority of European DNA and African Americans was actually deposited before the Civil War. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, my camera like low-key just stopped recording. I don't know why, and I feel like looking at this and I keep on belching. Either way, where were we? Yes, the status of women and of children inheriting the status of their mother as a slave. Like I said, at this time, a majority of mixed race people, or mulatto as they called them in that era, would have had slaveholding white fathers and enslaved mothers, you know, enslaved black mothers. So it really made sense when they passed that law to make sure that during, you know, obviously these are non-consenting exploitative relationships between slaveholding men and enslaved women and girls, that those assets could still be protected and they could actually incentivize the exploitation and abuse of these women by their masters, their sons, and even overseers. It's another thing that is also very racialized in American history. But again, what I'm really getting to is I'm just trying to say is that society is built 100% around race at that point. It's something that by the time you get to independence, by the time obviously you get into the end of the, you know, of slavery, you have a society where race is hierarchy, race is status. Race is something that is, it's political, it's social, every single facet of society is in some way based around the color of somebody's skin. And we even know the, you know, things like colorism, or, you know, terms like the house slave or field slave. There's even status that exists in that realm. So what I'm trying to, you know, what I'm really trying to get at is this is sort of what critical race theory is looking at historically and obviously more recently. But what we are trying to really shed light on is just the fact that this is a society that is based 100% around race. And for a lot of people, that's scary because it's something that they really just don't want to look into. It's something that they'd rather not discuss because they have a view of America and they want to hold on to that. But what I'm going to be getting into later is the nuances and subtleties of this American identity when it's used by right-wingers and more conservative people in the establishment, exactly what it means and why at the end of the day it's actually something that's incredibly problematic and something that historically has been used on terror campaigns and a lot of other things that sort of lead us to the issues that we have today in our society currently. All right, so I guess here we're going to end it. So again, critical race theory, Juneteenth, Black Lives Matter. Why are they un-American? Well, they're un-American because at the root, they really don't have that much to do with white people. And that historically is what makes something un-American. When you have conservative or far right-wing people, I forgot it was a certain senator who said something along the lines of the Black Lives Matter protests. He was like, let the real Americans. It was something that he had to apologize for, and I really hate because it just came up to me and I can't even look into it. But it's something that's so very interesting, and what I'm trying to talk about and get back at that American identity. It took 156 years to recognize Juneteenth as a federal holiday because there's a default whiteness in our society when it comes to importance. If an event does not center around whiteness, or it does not center around anything that has to do specifically with white people, it is an event that oftentimes can be ignored or just generally completely disregarded in our history. Obviously, like I said, African Americans have a very, very long history of celebrating Juneteenth, Jubilee Day, Emancipation Day, whatever you want to call it, dating back to the 19th century. But it's something that we as Americans nationally are really just coming to terms with, and there's a reason behind that. It's un-American because it really just doesn't have to do with white people. Again, I'm somebody who's 100% here for it, but we have to understand that after emancipation and after the Reconstruction era, you have white supremacist governments like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League completely overthrow democratically elected governments. in southern states where black men have been elected into office. And what for these white men who are rising up, you know, basically with this domestic terrorism, they're actually not overthrowing a government that is American. They're overthrowing a government that is anti-American. Fundamentally, these groups are anti-American because they're actually completely impeding on the process of democracy. But at their root, they view themselves as American. It is that conservative, Christian, American, white American identity that a lot of these conservatives harken back to very often when they discuss these things and bring up their Americanness and weaponize the identity of being an American. They're sort of harkening back to this idea that American is literally just white and Christian, and nothing else matters. It's the logic of the Ku Klux Klan, who are a Christian organization. It's the logic of the White League. It's the logic of so many white supremacist groups in history. That identity, that being an American means looking like me, and anybody else who doesn't does not deserve to be here. They need to go back to Africa, Asia, or whatever they need to do. And it's something that is, again, very, very dangerous and very problematic. And we have to be very, very careful when people use that logic of something, you know, of my identity as an American or a true American, especially if it's even if it's somebody like Candace Owens, who does not physically fit that definition or that description, but is also, you know, obviously trying to court her base in thinking that sort of way. And I just think it's something that's, you know, we just really, I guess, need to pay more attention to. It's some of those subtleties that I think critical race theory looks into, like the subtlety of racism. It's very nuanced, it's very low-key, but at the same time it can be just as problematic and just as dangerous as the very overt racism we've seen over the course of our lifetime. Critical race theory, again, when you look at things like the fact that it took about a century for Oklahoma to actually implement the teaching of the Tulsa Race Massacre throughout its schools, think about things like that. Think about why you've never learned about the Elaine Race Massacre or Atlanta or Memphis, because there were so many of them that occurred, especially during the era following World War I, which was actually the peak of lynching in this country in the 1910s. It's something that you don't really look into because America has, again, a history of being racist, but at the same time, it's a history that I don't want to say it's not necessarily proud of, but it's a history that they want to be very nuanced about and very subtle about, because it's this identity that has been built up over time that, as the land of the free, as the home of the brave, it's something that, again, like I said, pertains to white people. But if you are not part of that group, you're either going to be completely ignored or disregarded, or, you know, these stories are, you know, these are stories that we just don't learn. And in my opinion, you know, why I think critical race theory is really important, because I think it gives us the opportunity to look at American history as critically as possible. It's one thing to raise a nation that hates your country, which is not something that, you know, obviously is very positive, but it's another thing to raise a generation that is completely ignorant of that history, a generation that views this country as just 100% positive. I understand why there's such a big campaign by Ted Cruz to get critical race theory to be completely banned nationwide. It's because he's probably very well aware of the implications and ramifications of teaching this history very, very honestly. But whenever I refer to default whiteness, I'm probably going to be referring to that several times in this channel. What I'm simply just looking at is the idea that anything that is un-American, anything that is not white or Protestant Christian is by definition something, you know, if we're going to look at the rhetoric of our founding fathers and all these laws that were passed by these men who were in power, anything that is not white, anything that's not Christian is un-American. So when I say that Juneteenth or Black Lives Matter and critical race theory are un-American, all I'm really just trying to say is that when you look at this country's track record, they are un-American because they're holidays that actually recognize significant events in the lives and histories of African Americans in this country. One last point, the legislative segregation, something that is so interesting that I saw Candace Owens mention, but several other conservatives mentioned, is that recognizing Juneteenth as legislative, it's like segregation, is this idea that July 4th, which is the Independence Day, which again was derived around the freedoms and liberations of white people, is something that isn't segregated because, again, there's a default whiteness there. But when you're recognizing the end of chattel slavery in this country, which freed millions of enslaved black men, women, and children, all of a sudden it's segregation because blackness is not default. Blackness has to be about race. It's something that makes it's this sort of idea that it's so easy to tell a black person you're focusing too much on race, you're focusing too much on race, get over it, when you consider that blackness has always been something that has been, it's been ridiculed, it's been debased in our history and society, and that's simply the point of recognizing that freedom, the end of bondage for these people, is something that can be offensive to an identity of whiteness that is oftentimes very, very fragile and built upon a notion of superiority. It's just something that I think is obviously very, very ridiculous, but I really wanted to address that again. It's a perfect example of default whiteness that I'm going to mention, and again, I'm going to say it again many, many times in other videos, but this was just my opinion, and I really just wanted to get it out there, and I'm glad that I guess I'm finally at the end of the video. There's other things that I wanted to get into that I didn't get into, only because this camera does not have that much space, and it's probably going to die soon. But thank you guys so much for watching. I don't know how, I'm trying to upload at least a week, once a week, so we'll just see where it goes from there. But thank you guys so much for watching, and see you next time on Zay Historicizes.